Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the OK Grognard Show. It is Thursday, December 10th, 10 a.m. Central, in beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Well, it's Thursday, and that means it's GMing Tips Day. But for the last couple of Wednesdays, we've been going through the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide section on the first dungeon. And now we come to a section that I think would just be better off moved over to a GMing Tips Day instead of a campaign discussion day. I mean, really, it could fit in either. There's no reason why it couldn't. Sup there, Rick? And this is part of the reason why we're changing the format when we get into the new year and just putting all the setting, world building, campaign discussion, GMing tips, building adventures, putting all of that on one day in one show on Thursdays after the new year, where we'll just have 2 a week instead of every day. All of that stuff happening on Thursday, and then on Mondays we'll be looking at the news and announcement stuff. We'll be looking at GM reviews. Some of that, and then also talking about some other shows. Maybe do some response. I think a lot of times I watch someone else's stream or listen to a podcast, and I kind of want to respond to it, but not just in their comments. And it's not really so much needing to respond or refute anything they say, but just that what they're saying or what their discussion topic becomes a sort of a springboard toward some thoughts I'm having about first edition D&D. And quite often when I'll listen to something like that, their stuff is generic D&D-esque. It could be any edition, and maybe I want to hone it in specifically to how it would relate to a first edition thing. Or maybe they're talking about a different edition altogether, and I want to bring it around their idea, their thought, their springboard toward at least a brief discussion on a first edition issue that is similar to one they're having in a fifth edition game or a third edition game or something else. Sometimes even just a different game system altogether. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff that we're going to put on Mondays. And it'll be, more or less loose like we do it now. I'll figure out the day before or that day what I want on the agenda for the day. More like a radio show than a podcast or a stream that schedules all of their content in advance. And that way I can be more flexible and address things that are concerning me or in a given moment on a given day. But as I said, I wanted to move this over to GMing Tips Day, because we're talking about, I see what I need to do. All right, one more time. Back over here, pop this up. Where is that section on the, that's how far we got. Detection of unusual circumstances, traps, and hearing noise. Regardless of the means, it takes effort and concentration to perform any of these activities. A gnome, for instance, must remain relatively quiet. Good luck. No, I'm kidding. And concentrate for a turn to detect facts about an underground setting. Likewise, a dwarf must work at it. An elf doesn't detect secret doors 16 and 2/3% of the time by merely passing them unless he or she is actually concentrating on the act. A character with a sword must have it out and be thinking about its power in order for the weapon to communicate anything to him or her. To sum it up, don't give players a free lunch. All caps, exclamation point, says Gary. Tell them what they see, quote unquote. Allow them to draw their own conclusions and initiate whatever activity they desire. You are the source of their input, a timekeeper, and the motivator of all not connected with them. That is sufficient to keep you busy, rest assured. So, GMing tips. Here's one of the reasons, right? So many people just automatically roll for elves when they're passing, just merely passing within a few feet of a secret door. And he clearly says, an elf doesn't detect secret doors 16.2% of the time, 1 in 6, by merely passing them unless he or she is actually concentrating on the act. I've always been a big proponent of finding secret doors when they're there. I don't give them away, but so usually I wait until someone mentions they're an elf. You know, it doesn't have to be total laser focus, this concentration, in my opinion. It just has to be brought to mind. So maybe I don't usually check. Maybe we've got a couple of elves walking at the first rank of a party of 10, and they're wandering down this 10-foot wide and that 10-foot wide. I'm not rolling a bunch of dice. I'm not rolling at all. And I think at a certain point, what usually happens in my games is that a player will say, don't forget, we've got a couple of elves up front. Do we detect any secret doors? And when they actually do that, I consider them then concentrating, having brought it up. They must be thinking about it. And that's when I'll start rolling. But if they don't mention anything like that and they're just hustling along, moving along this passage and that passage, I don't roll for it. It's not automatic. So too, the gnome or the dwarf underground, noticing a ramped hallway, noticing that they've changed elevations or depths beneath the ground. One of their natural abilities, but here, once again, it also states that they need to be concentrating on it. So unless they bring it up, unless they, and I don't mean to say either that they need to be specifically telling me, all right, I'm checking for ramps, I'm thinking about my depth, I don't need them to rattle off the list of their abilities for me. I need them to be thinking about it in some way. Even if they just offhandedly say, man, we got to be 2 levels down by now, or how far down, even saying it to someone else. Did we come down another stairway? Because this feels deeper. Even if they say anything that gives me some indication that they're thinking about things in that way. If they have an ability to determine being at depth or on a ramp or whatever, I don't make them spill out a bag of marbles to figure out if the floor is ramped in some way. Sometimes it can be obvious. Sometimes it can be so subtle over a long hallway, for instance, that nobody's going to notice it unless they do something like spill a bag of marbles or have that innate ability and concentrate. And that's when we do the checks. That's when we give them that information when they're focused on that activity. So, too, always important to remember swords that have, let's say, a treasure finding ability. You need the character needs to engage with the weapon, much in the same way that having a wand of finding secret doors. Hey, Bob, how's it going? Needs to cast that. Now, of course, the sword doesn't have charges; it can just do that innately, but you need to be focused on it. So, if you're going to be using any of its innate abilities, you have to make a connection with that weapon, with that sword, and then that kind of information can be gleaned. So, there you go. What a nice little succinct definition of a game master, too, huh? The source of their input, a timekeeper, and a motivator of all not connected with them. It is a definition that requires that it refer to the relationship between the game master and the other players. Game master is, after all, a player of the game. You're all engaged in this activity together. So it's nice to have a definition that connects with the other players while still delineating certain duties, certain role that you have as a game master. Interesting. Let's move a little bit further on. Assume that your players are continually wasting time. Well, that starts a paragraph off. Parentheses, thus making the so-called adventure drag out into a boring session of dice rolling and delay. Assume that your players are continually wasting time if they are checking endlessly for traps and listening at every door. That's a tricky one. You put somebody into Tomb of Horrors, for instance, they better be checking way more often than is typical of a regular adventuring band. So I don't know that if this is universal advice here. If this persists, Gary continues, despite the obvious displeasure you express, the requirement that helmets be doffed and mail coifs be removed to listen at a door, and then be carefully replaced, the warnings about ear seekers, the frequent checks, ear seekers being those little things that burrow into your ear when you stick your ear to a door and the DM is tired of you wasting time, as Gary says here. The warnings about ear seekers and frequent checking for wandering monsters. Then you all have to take more direct part in things, mocking their overcautious behavior as near cowardice, rolling huge handfuls of dice and then telling them the results are negative, and statements to the effect that you detect nothing, and nothing has detected you so far, might suffice. If the problem should continue, then rooms full with silent monsters will turn the tide. But that is the stuff of later adventures. So he's saying this isn't the sort of thing that doesn't happen with new players so often as it does with players that have become fearful. And let's be clear, if your players are this cautious, if your players are this worried that things are going to happen to them every moment of the game, that's a little bit on you as a GM. So You've created an environment. We were talking 2 Wednesdays ago about the first adventure, this section we're dealing with here, and we were talking about how that NPC thief that is or that NPC that is putting himself up as a guide to help them discover this first adventure site, the ruins of the monastery, uh, and how it's actually a thief and he's just waiting for his chance to steal from you. Not powerful enough to go it alone in this ruins, but happy to push other people in that direction. And then when they come limping out with treasure, all hurt and sore and bloody, picking them off or stealing from them if that's easier. So if every NPC is always out to get the players, and if every door needs to be listened at because there's always monsters and they're always vicious and they're always right on the other side of the door. You can't open a door without them being right there. If when you're on wilderness encounters, and this one I think a lot of DMs fall into this trap. If you're in the wilderness and you've got watches set and all of this, and then anytime there's a wandering monster in the wilderness, it's on the camp before you even know it. It's attacking you. If you're traveling overland during the day, and if anytime there's a wandering monster, roll for initiative. It's right on top of you. You know, these things got to happen with some warning. You've got to make sure that you're checking for distances, how far away they're going to be. Maybe they don't even notice the party. You got to check for that too. You got to make sure of it that they're aware of it. They may be caught up in their own stuff. Maybe they're checking their cell phone and not looking up, and they don't notice the adventurers. Lichens in the wilderness. Yep, the kind of stuff gets boring, sure. Yep, if it's just all this searching, all this listening, all this stuff, moment after moment after moment, and you're using full hours of your 2 or 3 hours worth of gaming to be so cautious. And if in turn the GM has forced that issue because anytime anything happens, it happens without warning, and you're surprised, and they get first attack, or they're right on top of you. If all of that's happening like that all of the time, it's no longer exciting. It's no longer a big deal. It's just the way of the world, and that's not an adventure. That's just a constant terror where you're constantly just rolling dice and you're never really getting a chance to play the game in earnest or make any decisions about how you're going to interact with the world, because it's interacting with you whether you like it or not. So be careful not to do that. That can be very frustrating for the players, and you're going to find it boring too, even as a GM. Let's check on doors here. Check on doors. Doors. As a rule of thumb, all doors are hard to open and hard to keep closed or open for player characters, while inhabitants of the dungeon find little difficulty in this regard. Regardless of how a door opens, it is usual that its weight and condition require that force be used to swiftly operate it. This is represented by the roll of a d6 for each person involved in pushing, pulling, lifting, sliding, or whatever. A roll of 1 or 2 typically indicates success. Anything above indicates the door remains unopened. It's in the player's handbook on the character ability strength, what their chance is. Very heavy doors might reduce the chances by half. Locked doors might open if 2 or even 3 simultaneous ones are rolled. Most doors are about 8 foot wide. This is kind of interesting here. And this allows up to 3 characters to attempt opening. A door of 3 feet or less width allows but a single character to make an attempt. If wooden doors, always metal bound naturally, are broken down by axes and the like, it will take some time, a full turn as usual, and require at least 3 checks to see if the nearby and or wandering monsters are attracted by the noise. Doors can also be blasted away by fireballs and other spells, for example. This will not be likely to draw monsters to the vicinity immediately. Any such destruction will, however, attract the attention of all passing creatures and possibly cause future problems. Intelligent dungeon inhabitants will certainly make efforts to repair the damage if it is in their interest to do so. Finally, metal doors, usually locked, will be very difficult to open, requiring a knock spell or similar means most of the time. Doors. Most doors 8 foot wide. That's just... Now I can see where he's coming from. Because a lot of the adventure movies, if you will, from the 60s, 70s, 60s, 50s, earlier even, the old Sinbad movies, all sorts of movies like that would depict any sort of dungeon or crypt or whatever to have this huge sort of monumental style doorway that several people would have to shoulder against and shove back as it ground to a halt if you stopped. They wouldn't swing on their own hinges. They would need to be forced every inch of the way to make a large enough gap to open up. You know, it was to make all these things big and impressive and whatnot. But it doesn't make sense for a regular dungeon for doors to be like this. It doesn't make sense if this was a complex that was used routinely for this purpose or that purpose, whether it was an underground temple with a bunch of facility buildings or rooms around it. If it was a crypt where as people would die off, they were brought down and ritualistically put in one portion of it or another. So there was comings and goings, and there were clerics and whatnot coming in and out, checking on the status of things, making sure that rats weren't getting into the vaults and chewing on the bones, and upkeeping the things, and saying some patrons may have paid for regular prayers to be said over their remains. So there are rituals that are ongoing where some priest would come down and give the respect to the dead that they have either earned or purchased. Crypts, mausoleum, graveyards, or a fortified temple, says Excel 809. Yes, absolutely. It's definitely those are definitely the types of places, Mark, that might have huge monumental type doors. So you have to decide, is it in when you create a location or when you put a location into the game. Yeah, let's pop this up and then we can see that for a second. Excuse me, one. All right, there we go. You have to decide if this is going to be a tough location, if it's going to be a former facility with regular usage, and that'll help you determine size and style of the doors that are involved in it. And this can be true even if it's something you've picked up as an adventure online or at a game store that somebody else has written, and if they're not clear about it. if they don't delineate, you know, in what section. Maybe the entry door is a big old hulking door like that, but maybe all the interior doors need to be regularly used. Maybe they're still being regularly used. I'm not a fan, and I don't know. You're gonna have to make the decision for yourself. But I am not a fan of all doors in a dungeon being easily used by dungeon denizens, but being super difficult for any player characters who happen to be adventuring in there to utilize. I could see how the occasional door is tricky. Okay, you know what? If you lift it up by the handle and push, it doesn't drag and then it sweeps right open. And the dungeon denizens know this, but the players don't. So when they're just shoving their shoulder into the door, they're forcing it against the floor and it doesn't open as easily. Okay, but not every door. Maybe that's, a trick that one or two dungeon denizens know about one or two doors. But it shouldn't be a universal thing, I don't think. Gary wants it to be universal. Um, and I'm not saying that players should have it so easy. I think it gets a little boring when a game stalls out because nobody can roll a 1 or a 2. Even the DM behind the screen has decided, well, your dice suck. I'm going to try rolling it for you. And you know what? When I run games, often I do the doors. I do the actual rolling. Because if it's a magically locked door and the players haven't checked for magic, all they know is that they keep shoving their shoulder into it and it's not opening. So I'll roll behind the screen. But let that be the exception to the rule. Roll the die, but maybe just go ahead and have the door open. If it's inconsequential, don't act as if it's inconsequential. Just let it be so to keep the pace of the game going. Let it swing right open when they say, "Well, we open the door." Pick up a couple of dice and roll them, right? But they're ones and twos, and then describe what they see when the door swings open. Make sure you let them know whether it's opening their way, whether it's swinging left or right, no matter whether it's opening away or toward them. Keep stuff like that in mind, because even those little details are important if combat transpires. Um, Maybe at some point early in an adventure, if there's a complex with a lot of doors, see what the routine is. I don't necessarily like the ideas of all the doors always closing on their own, whether you close them or not. I'm never a fan of that. Now, maybe some doors are hung in such a way that they will swing closed if you just leave them to their own devices. But if you're playing that game where you're having them roll all the time and it's really hard to open them and they're scraping the door open, those things don't move on their own. You have to consciously want to close them. So maybe early on in the game, you ask them, okay, so if you're going to open it, if you're going to move on, are you closing doors behind you? Are you closing this door behind you? And then once they make that decision, say, well, is that generally what you're going to do with doors? Do I have to keep asking you every single time? Or do you want to just say now, after we go through a door that we've opened, we're going to close it again? Or we're specifically not closing doors behind us. And let them be left open. Let the path be clear as far as they know. It might embolden them to strive to adventure even deeper into the complex. Right on. All right. Well, we're just about there, so I'm gonna close this out here. We've got concealed doors coming up next. Maybe concealed doors, secret doors. You know what? In keeping with our new policy of not being so strict with the general theme of the day, whether it's GMing tips or campaign building or building adventures. Like tomorrow, campaign discussion, building adventures. Since we're moving all of that stuff to one day on Thursday, so that we don't have to delineate it so much and say, all right, I've got to talk about campaign discussion, but I can't give any GMing tips. We won't talk about building adventures. That comes on Friday. Since all of that is going to be put into one basket, I think we can say we're going to pick this up tomorrow with this same section, the first dungeon, and we'll move on into concealed doors and secret doors. And that's what we'll do tomorrow. Excellent. Thursday, December 10th, the OK Grognard Show. I want to thank everybody for popping into the chat today. I want to thank everybody for watching on Twitch. Appreciate it. Please do follow the channel. It's always a good idea. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., join us again for Building Adventures. We'll be looking at those concealed and secret doors and further into that section. GM reviews on Saturday, rules retrospective on Sunday, Monday, weekly news and announcements, our cartography and world building next Tuesday, campaign discussion on Wednesday, and back around the horn to GMing tips when we get there on Thursday. If you're catching up with us on YouTube, thank you very much. Please do subscribe to the channel. Hey, George, good to see you. Good to see you two there. Sarah, thank you. Good show. Appreciate it. Make sure you give us a thumbs up if you're on YouTube and you're watching a video and you enjoy it. And also, feel free to leave comments. This has been the OK Grognard Show from beautiful Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Bye-bye.